there, it's Matthew Blades, and welcome to another episode of Learn From People Who Lived It. So today we're going to sit down with Melissa and Dr. Frank Bavacqua, and we're going to talk about Melissa's son who died by suicide at the age of 21. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a dad. I've got two kids at home right now. One's 17, one's about to turn 15. And I can't imagine their incredible lives ending in just a handful of years. My heart completely goes out to Melissa and her family for all that they have endured. And I'm telling you, if you stick around and listen to this episode of Learn From People Who Lived It, even if you've never had to deal with suicide in any way, shape, or form, Melissa's going to give you something that you can use in your life. At one point, she makes this comment that's so powerful to me, where she says, I have all this information I wish I didn't have. And how many of us have had to learn things the hard way, but now we know more. Now we could help somebody else on the other side. And that's exactly why we're here, to learn from people who lived it. So before we get into her episode, I want to key you into a couple of really cool, exciting announcements. Number one, we officially have our resources page open and available to you right now on the website learnfrompeoplewholivedit.com. You can click the resources tab and you'll find a handful of people who we have vetted. These are partners that we believe in. We know them. We've either had them on the podcast or I've worked with them directly, and they would be most interested in helping and guiding you through your journey. Please have a look and use the link at learnfrompeoplewholivedit.com is how you say that. And that's how the businesses will know that that traffic came from our community here at Learn From People Who Lived It. All right, let's sit back and settle in to this 1 hour conversation with Melissa and Dr. Frank Bavacqua on Learn From People Who Lived It.
Find Learn From People Who Lived It wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from People Who Lived It.
Welcome to another episode of Learn From People Who Lived It.
I'm Melissa. I'm 54 years old.
Hi, Melissa. What story are you here to share today?
Well, I'm here to specifically share a little bit about my lost story. I lost my son, who was 21 years old, just almost 7 years ago. We're almost at the 7-year mark. And specifically, what I want to talk about is trauma and grief, and how, while especially in suicide loss, both of them are prevalent with almost every survivor, they are not the same thing. One can be healed and one you can learn to live alongside. So,
who do you hope hears this?
Specifically, I hope that the mom that I was back in the early days hears what I have to say and here's some hope. Here's a way that maybe they think they could find a little hope and step into healing from there. And I just hope that they hear that they're not alone, because this is such a lonely place. And everything I do was born from that space and not being able to find what I needed. So that's who I hope hears it specifically. But I also hope everyone that needs to hear it does, because even people that haven't suffered this loss or haven't suffered a loss like this yet may need to hear this in order to help themselves or to help somebody that needs it.
It's just not an easy road to go down. Welcome to Learn From People Who Lived It. I'm Matthew. You met Melissa. Let's say hi to Dr. Frank Bavacqua down there. How are you, pal?
I'm good. Good to be back.
Yeah, it's great to have you along for the ride. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and let me tell you why. There's a line that Melissa wrote to us, Frank, that just really got my attention. She said, I know I will always be a work in progress, but now I also know I can live a good life right alongside my grief. And that really got my attention because, you know, you and I talk about it all the time, Dr. Frank, that the difference between mental and physical pain and health is that you can usually fix the physical. The mental you're going to have with you for the rest of your life, and you're going to need to learn how to roll with it. You're going to need to learn how to deal with it. And so from the doctor's perspective, what are you hoping to get out of today's conversation?
I mean, when you look at both physical and mental pain, I think it's both. I think there's each of those has some types that are with us forever and some things that we can kind of heal from. And there are things that are going to affect us emotionally in our lives that we can potentially kind of heal from. And there are those that kind of scar us in a certain way, they leave a scar on our heart forever. And we learn to live with it. And we get the pleasure of talking to people who, like you said, work in progress, never done, but maybe are kind of on the other side of some hump in their life, and they've figured some things out, and we get to learn from them today. So that's pretty fun.
Amen. That's why we call it Learn from People Who Lived It. So we're recording this episode on July 19th of 2023, and it's worth noting that the 7-year anniversary of your son dying by suicide is coming up on Sunday, August 7th. Typically on this podcast, Melissa, we start with the first 10 years of people's lives, but I don't know that we need to do that here, nor do I think it's that important. What I do think would be important to start with is let's go back to May, June, July of 2016, just a few minutes before this event's taking place. And let's start to set the table for where things are with you and your family and your son and all of those things. So wherever you're comfortable starting.
Okay. Well, May is about where I would probably actually start, although it started in just a few months prior to that. I'd probably typically start talking about that time period around March. So just a few months prior. And Alex was a sophomore. He was going to be a junior right before he died, but he was a sophomore ending his sophomore year in college. And he was at a rigorous academic college. He had graduated high school with an international baccalaureate diploma. So he was on a path of academic pressure, if you will, even in college. He had played baseball at a high level and chose not to go out in college. I think he could have, but he didn't. But he instead went into Greek life. And the couple of years of being in college and juggling all the things that a young person does at that age, by spring semester, he was under a lot of pressure. He was starting to feel the pressure, if you will. I kind of say he got himself behind the 8 ball a bit because he let everything kind of happen and compile, and then his grades were in jeopardy. And that college had a program to kind of put them back on track a little bit. Before they went on academic probation type of situation, they were kind of preemptive. And so he was in that program that semester so that his grades didn't go the wrong direction. And so all of the pressure just kind of was enough to make him say, Mom, I'm making an appointment with the school counselor. That was our first indication that something was wrong. And I had never had any history of Alex having, mental health issues or ever asking to see a counselor. They had been a couple of times. I had divorced. And so we had done some of that when they were little, but nothing that was ever led by his mental health status, if you will. And so I just supported it. I said, what do we need to do and how can I help? And long story short, he wasn't getting a lot of help there. There was long lines, meaning long wait times. And they wanted to throw medication at him right away. And he kind of took it for a few weeks and didn't like how it made him feel. So he stopped. And it just kind of became a dead end situation because between not being able to get appointments when you need them and, them just kind of tossing an antidepressant his way, it just wasn't what he was looking for. So by the time, and he was living there full time at that point, Matthew, he was that kid that when he moved out to go to college said, I'm living there. He just wanted to be independent that way. And so he was living at the frat house, but his place of employment closed that summer. And in a small college town in the Midwest, it wasn't going to be that interesting. So he did, for the first time since he'd gone to college, come home for 5 weeks of the summer. So by the time we got him home, I was just kind of watching him in the beginning, thinking he said he's fine. He seems fine. But it's that, mom thing of going, well, he had never said I'm really struggling before. And so I wanted to give him the space to breathe. And I did that. And by the time he was ready to go home, we did have a one-on-one face-to-face, him and I. And I just said, tell me how you are. You seem good. But what do we need to do? And the conversation came around to a place where I felt like by the end of it that he probably was going to make a decision to come home. Just wasn't a good fit. Too much pressure there. But I had to kind of tell him, son, sometimes it's not about. I think he was really feeling like he was going to bail on a commitment, not only to that particular college path, but the fraternity. And I kind of said sometimes in life it isn't about whether something's wrong or, it's just about choosing a different path. This may not be the right path for you right now. And I just saw a light bulb in him. And so I didn't know whether he was going to decide to come home right away or maybe at semester's end, but I just knew in my gut that he was going to come home. And so I sent him back with him saying he was good to go and great and would let me know if he was feeling any pressure when he went back. And I had seen none of the signs that we all hear about and know about in the summer months or the summer weeks that we had him. And he went back, and 8 days later, he was gone.
So I'm going to talk to Dr. Frank for just a second, if I can, because I had a similar experience, Melissa. When I started my mental health journey, they wanted to throw medicine at me almost right away. Number one, I didn't really want to take it. Number two, I didn't really believe that it was a chemical imbalance. I felt like it was a deep spiritual wound, a deep wound that had taken place earlier in my life. And so, Dr. Frank, when it comes to people working things out, medicine can certainly be helpful. There's no way around that. For the right people, it's the perfect thing. Yeah. But it's not for everybody. So how do you feel about that when she says that?
So, a couple of things. I think mental health as a whole sometimes gets a little bit of a bad rap because medication is the prevalent solution sometimes. There's no getting around it. Like there's a lot of money in medication, right? And so sometimes I think there is that bad reputation of, there's pushing meds and that kind of a thing. Bigger picture, I've always used kind of the back pain analogy in that there are a lot of different professionals out there who can attempt to help fix your back pain, but they all have a different tool, right? So if you go to a massage therapist, they're probably going to think that massage can help your back pain. If you go to a chiropractor, they're going to think that adjustments may be able to help your back pain. If you go to a surgeon, they might think that surgery could help your back pain. You go to a physical therapist, they're going to probably think that physical therapy can help your back pain, right? And so if you go to somebody who has prescription privileges, they might think that they can prescribe something that helps, right? So it's not necessarily about mental health as a whole, always just pushing medication. That's not always the case, but I do think it plays a little bit of a factor in terms of who you're going to see and what kind of power or authority or tools in the toolbox that person has, right? If you go to see I say just a mental health counselor, somebody who can't prescribe medication, they're probably going to start with therapy and maybe recommend, going to see a psychiatrist or somebody who can prescribe meds later if their first tool isn't working as effectively, right? So it's a lot of that could be simply just the first person that you go to see, what tool do they have? And they're probably going to start with their tool first.
Let me ask you a question, Melissa. One of the things I'm thinking about as Dr. Frank is talking is we know this. One of the side effects of taking some of those medicines to help out with our mental health and imbalance is that can actually escalate our suicidal ideations. It can actually escalate our suicidal thoughts when we come off of it. We know that, right? Like everybody, that's why if you're on those medications, they have a whole system and protocol on how to come off of them safely. Do you think or do you feel like any of that stuff contributed to what was going on in his head?
Yes, to a point. I don't know that he was on the medication long enough. According to him, it was a couple of weeks. And I know that some of these medications can have, depending on who they are, they can affect you fairly quickly, fairly adversely. Usually that's a little early for the type of medication he was on because it hadn't really built up in his system yet. And when we did get the prescription bottle from his things, it echoed what he had told me. There was probably a couple weeks worth of medicine left in there. And I don't know that he had refilled it according to him. So I'm not sure. I can't rule that out. I think, hindsight, you always look at everything. I say I didn't see anything beforehand. I have a wealth of knowledge I wish I didn't have now. And because of that wealth of knowledge, I've even brought into question the head injuries he had as an athlete in high school, the age that he was at this point, in college. And then you look at the statistics of head injuries and, especially with what they've done with even the NFL and things like that, and knowing how, depending on when you receive that head injury, how profoundly it can have an effect on you in the long run. But Alex had a perfect storm of events, I believe, that occurred. And I don't know that isn't more common than we think it is. But he also had the influence of a person in his that would have had a negative influence, which, if you're in that crisis state, you want the person to come into your world that's going to have an influence the other direction. That's going to be the person that helps kind of pull you up and say, let's get help. Let's see what we can do if it's that bad. When the wrong person walks into your life at that moment, it can have life-ending effects. So he kind of had a lot of things that were just kind of came together, I think, at the right time, wrong time, however you want to phrase that, in a perfect storm type situation. And I think, could the drugs have played a part potentially? But I think there was a lot more at play than just the drugs in our.
I'm tempted to jump in here real quick. Just big picture. I mean, I think as any parent listening to this, or potential parent, future parent, this idea of, who are my kids hanging around, right? And what kind of influence do those friends have on my kid? Can you speak a little bit? You said the wrong person, was kind of maybe in his ear. What made that person the wrong person?
Well, that person, we weren't aware of that person at first, because of the circumstances that followed. We became aware of that person around 8 months after Alex was gone. At that point, there had been 3 other people go in the same manner in the same house.
Whoa. And
so at that point, we leaned into the idea that something was wrong. By the time you hear that 4 young men have died in the same manner in the same house in such a short period, you tend to kind of, I had people saying to me, what's going on, right? Immediately after 4.
Yeah, that's beyond a coincidence.
Right.
For sure.
And we all know, of course, I say that we all know, many of us that live in the world of suicide loss come to know about clusters and contagion. And so I learned about that crash course and wanted it, for lack of a better term, words are really hard in the world I live in, but wanted it to, I guess, fit that model, so to speak, meaning, just kind of the idea that but what we came to find out after death 4 was that the police were even looking at this one person in common with all the deaths. And by the end of, by the time we were almost at a year, there was actually 5 deaths. So,
wow.
So to put a succinct word on it, coercion is the one that I would use. So you're looking at a coercion case, not just an influence situation. Someone that was actually had the rhetoric to say, things like you'll be better off and your family will understand and you'll get relief and all the things that would glorify the choice versus and make it okay and help somebody that's already struggling with feeling like this is where they're at, and to kind of give them that nudge in that direction. That was definitely what this person was doing.
God, it's so infuriating. Oh, how do you deal with that rage? That would light my fire.
Well, it did. And when we found out at 8 months, initially the police kind of led us in the direction of, they weren't sure at that point that we weren't looking at foul play. So we spent a few months as a family doing this flip-flop of now thinking I had to go home and tell my other 2 children that it was possible Alex had not died by suicide. And we had to live by that thought for a few months. Eventually we were able to get enough information to understand that indeed all of them had actually died by their own hand. However, this person of influence was in their life that had kind of pushed things in that direction.
Wow.
So.
Wow, you said something earlier that almost made me cry, which was you said, I have a wealth of information that I wish I didn't have. Because you've been kind of forced to learn so much about this lane with folks. And we are, as a society, seeing massive increases in suicide. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of a two-part question. I'm going to lead with Frank, but you feel free to jump in where you want to go. We hear about things like suicidal ideation, mm-hmm. which I'd like for you to define.
Forgot you were starting with
you, Frank.
Well, I mean, it kind of is what it sounds like, right? The thought that's crossing your mind that being dead essentially would be better off than being alive.
So when do you think for Alex, it went from an ideation to something a little bit more serious?
Right. It went from being suicidal ideation to being suicidal. In the evening that he made the choice, I don't believe that it had never entered his mind. I believe many more of us in this world, again, that wealth of knowledge, many more of us in this world struggle with regular suicidal ideation, not necessarily suicidal thoughts, but suicidal ideation more than people realize. And knowing my son and his personality and his big heart, and that he was always the one that was there for everyone, all the things I know about him, he probably had this idea before. It wasn't like the idea was planted, but I don't know that he had ever been suicidal before. And so okay. I think that there's, like many things in our life, there's a lot of times a fine line. And once you take that step across that fine line, it can alter things drastically.
Let's assume that there's somebody here because of that word suicide. Maybe somebody in their life is thinking about it, has ideations. Maybe there's already been an attempt, something like that. And again, to go back and forth to both of you, and Melissa, I'll start with you. What would your advice be for another mom in your situation whose son has come to her and said, "Mom, I don't feel good. I don't feel like things are right. And, I'm nervous I'm going to hurt myself." What would, now being this wealth of information that you have, what would you say to her?
Well, answering from my mom gut, my mom response and my wealth of information responses are two different things. My mom gut goes to the place to go, I'm not the person to ask because I have a dead child. My wealth of information tells me differently. It tells me that had I known, I would have pushed farther into Alex's boundaries, if you will, and asking him more pointed, direct questions to start with, to ask if he was suicidal, to ask if he was, not just to say, are you okay? Not to say, let me know if you're, and I actually think in some ways I don't carry a lot of guilt more than, parents can't get away from guilt. We're going to live with some guilt. Our kid crosses the street wrong. We're going to feel like we didn't teach him to cross, to lurk both ways or whatever. But, above and beyond normal parent guilt, I feel like I've, in the process, put most of my guilt about the things maybe I could have done differently to bed. But I do think I could have done some things differently. I have no way of knowing if they would have made a difference in my case, but I think in many, they absolutely could, which is you have to make your child or the person you're talking to feel safe enough that they can actually share that they're that sad, that they're that vulnerable, that they're that overwhelmed, because most of the time I think they test the waters with people. I feel like Alex did a little bit with that, not even knowing. Like, I think sometimes it's subconscious, right? It's the 80%, not the 20 that they're working from. And so he was working from that place of testing me out, I think in March when he first told me he was going to the counselor. And in that moment, he did say, this is where I know that he had had some thoughts before, some suicidal thoughts when he first got depressed, as he called it, because he said, I'm going because one night I felt bad enough I thought of hurting myself. Those were the words he used. I started crying like mom just started crying, and we're on the phone. We're not on a FaceTime or a Zoom. Pre-COVID, everybody wasn't on Zoom all the time. And so I did what moms do sometimes. And I feel like in that moment, and the things that I said, even though they weren't, I didn't tell him not to say that, but you definitely don't want to tell somebody not to say that. I should have figured out how to compose myself and lean into that conversation. Instead, I said things like, that's serious, Alex. You need to come home. In other words, I was kind of vigilant about, instead of just sitting back while leaning in, if that makes sense, and saying, let's talk about this, because there's nothing wrong with the feelings that you're having. Those are perfectly normal feelings, to be able to normalize the idea of suicidal ideation while letting them know that help is there in order to not get to that crisis point. Because what I have heard over and over and over in all the conversations I've had with moms and other suicide loss survivors is most of us feel that by the time our child or loved one reached the suicidal decision, they were in crisis. And unless you happen to walk in or they let you know, you might not have been able to do anything.
Yeah. What about you, Frank? What do you say to that?
This has come up with some other guests that we've had too. This idea of, you use the phrase leaning in, and I like that. But leaning in proactively, early, young, before kids turn into teenagers and all sorts of things happen, internally and externally for them. Normalizing hard conversations like this early. And I think most people have this aversion of, why would I want to bring up something like that if they don't have the idea themselves? Oh, I don't want to plant the idea in them. But I think every teenager at some point, somewhere in there, they question something, and for some it's more dire than others, but that happens a little bit for everybody. So you're not planting an idea that they're not going to somehow come across somewhere along the way anyway, and I think for the first time today, we're talking about somebody who reached out to someone for help, this other person that we were talking about before. And for the first time, we're hearing a story about that person not being helpful and in fact being quite harmful. That's probably not something that we think about. I think most of the time we think about, if we reach out for help, at worst, they're not going to be helpful. And at best, maybe they will be helpful, but it can be worse than not helpful, right? It can actually be harmful. So starting those conversations, if you're the safe person in that kid's life, starting those conversations way before you think you need to, so that it's not as hard to bring up later when it needs to be.
Yeah, I love that, because I wonder, I have two teenage boys. They're 17 and 15, right? And I have a pretty front row seat to what it's like to be in the brain of a teenage boy. And, I wonder for Alex, how many times did he have that conversation in his head before he came to mom? Did he feel that way for a few days before he mustered up the courage to call you and have that conversation? And what Frank's talking about would be valuable in that case, because it would be normalized earlier, right? And so I really do love that piece of advice. Melissa, I'm going to ask you a very difficult question, if I may. Yeah. I want to say that there's somebody here who's gone through what you've gone through. Maybe it's a lot fresher for them. And you said something a few minutes ago about parent guilt and going through all of that. How did you make peace with your guilt?
I'll put it in one word to start with, and then I'll expand on it. Knowledge.
Please. Knowledge.
Yeah. I dove into learning everything I could about suicidal ideation, how people get there, mental health issues, all of it. And, I always reference Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, as a good, now it's a heavy,
Amazing.
That's not a light read. That's not VC Andrews on the porch for sure. It's definitely, and I had to go to audiobook for it because early grieving moms are in such a fog you don't even understand. I didn't understand. I thought I knew grief until this happened, right? This doesn't fit in any other grief box I had ever had, this loss of a child, especially to suicide. And so I just had to dive into knowledge and to understand how a person can get to that place and it not be something that we had any control over. Meaning, I think, and this piggybacks on what you guys were just talking about, but I think we live in this culture that, especially the ads and all of the campaigns that we see out there about suicide prevention, it seems like such a good thing on the surface if you don't live in this world. If you live in the world of having lost your child to suicide and you hear all the ad campaigns that tell you, we need to fix this because 100% of all suicides are preventable. It's a really harsh thing to land when you're talking about guilt, right? That means I somehow should have been able to prevent my son's suicide, that somehow it was 100% preventable. I believe we need to live in a culture that's mental health empowering. And that speaks exactly what Doctor was speaking to, which is that we need to teach kids from a very early age how to address hard things, how to lean into them, how to know the language to use, how to know how to be vulnerable, which means you're also going to be teaching the parents of these children, right? But I think if we learn to empower ourselves where our mental health is concerned so we can speak out and find the help before we are in crisis, that's going to be so much larger. Now, that doesn't mean I don't believe in suicide prevention. I think that it does help in many. I think it's helped a lot of people. I think there's a lot of awareness out there. It's kind of like saying, should we pull away first aid training or awareness of the public to know how to save people by Heimlich or CPR? No, we shouldn't. Those are all basic knowledge. We should have the basic knowledge of what do we do if we see signs that someone's suicidal. But I don't think that's the Band-Aid. I don't think it's a Band-Aid. It's not the answer, right? It's not going to cure the ailment. It's just going to throw a little Band-Aid on it. So we have to be able to go bigger and further than we're comfortable going in order to ever make a real impact on this, I think.
Do you want to add anything to that, Frank? Because then I have another question.
I mean, there's a lot of ties between psychology and marketing. I've always 99% of marketing is psychology, right? And a lot of effective marketing is fear-based, even if it's something simple as this sale won't last forever, right? It is technically fear-based, or this fear of missing out, and it tries to motivate people to action. But you're right. It motivates people potentially who are on the front side of things, the ones who have never experienced this before, trying to get people to kind of proactively think about this. Basically putting this onus of 100% of suicides are preventable, meaning, I can take some action now to prevent that from happening in my life. The problem is when you're on the other side of it, that marketing campaign, it's kind of a slap in the face, right? To say the least. And I'm torn, right? Because if that campaign motivates people to act and something does get prevented, then that is a good thing. That's a positive thing. But at the same time, is there a way to do that, without kind of spitting in the face of people who are on the other side of it? But I mean, that's unfortunately what a lot of our marketing has become. It's, you hear terms like clickbait and those kind of how extreme can we be? How intense can we be? How fear inducing can we be to motivate people to act? And unfortunately it works. And that's why they keep doing it.
How, if I may, ask another question that's kind of difficult, which is, when my father passed away, I single-handedly watched our extended family fall apart. People didn't talk to each other anymore. It became harder to have conversations. How did you, in the days and weeks and months and years after, manage your family situation? Because you mentioned that you have another child too, right?
Two
more. So how did you move through the next couple of years? And please answer in a way that folks might learn from. Both the things that maybe you did that were great, and then maybe some things where you came up short and you wish you would have done something different because you didn't know better. But how did you move through the next year, 2 years?
Yeah, a couple of years for sure. So fairly quickly, after losing Alex and having the memorial, a week afterwards, my youngest went to college. So to try to even, tuck a kid into college a week after your other child has died at college is a pretty profound thing. If he was going on academic and baseball scholarship, and luckily to a private college 10 miles from our home. If he had been going hours away like Parker or like Alex had, I probably would have prepared Parker for mom's moving with you or you're not going because that's where my hypervigilance at that point, my hypervigilance was here. Like it wasn't going to happen to me again. At that point, all bets were off. If this could happen, anything could happen. And so luckily he had to live in the dorms, but because he was 10 miles away, he could come home on the weekend. So I was very in touch with him. My older child, my daughter, who was only 15 months older than Alex, but they had a grade between them based on how they started school and stuff. She was already out of the home, had her first child and second one on the way, was married.
Okay.
And so, but lived very close, and I saw her almost daily. So we just handled it by open communication from the beginning. And I think for all intents and purposes, the best that I know how to say that part was good. I worked really hard to say I'm going to try really hard, the best I know how, to be a good mom to you guys still, but you're going to have to let me know if I'm failing. Like I did say all those things, and it helped. I think it helped keep us more communicative with each other, more open about it. We talked about Alex a lot. We had different memorial events and commemorated his birthday that year and all those things. However, if I could go back and do something different, and I had always been this, for lack of better words, strong survivor kind of person, like the person everyone comes to and the person that's just always okay and all of that. And so I kind of tried to do what my default was, which was appear to be okay. Like I'm strong. I'll somehow figure this out. And inside, it literally felt like it was killing me. Like inside, it felt like this was going to claim my life. It was that hard. It hurt on a level I didn't understand. And therefore, I could have modeled more to my kids about how hard of a time I was having. I could have been more honest. I think it would have benefited them to see that and not have me. I wouldn't say I hid it. It wasn't like they never saw me cry. But I did find that I was making, in retrospect, I was making a concerted effort for my worst days to be days that I knew that they were never going to see. That the mom would still try to be put together as much as I could be. I was trying to still do all the things. And man, it was to my own detriment in the end. It was to my own detriment. And so, we went along really well for a few years. And at year 3, my daughter on her own made a split from talking to really myself, my other son. And that lasted for a couple of years. Now she had her own stuff she was dealing with. And I believe that it all compounded what had happened. We find that sometimes when our trauma occurs, or a really severe trauma, it kind of tends to unearth all of the other traumas in our life. And I think she was experiencing some of that. She was also a new mom. There was all the things. And all the things.
Yeah. That perfect storm you talked about earlier.
Yeah, that caused me to feel like I did everything I knew how to do, and yet here we still are. Here we still are in a broken place. Among all these broken pieces, we have another broken place to deal with, which is I didn't think the family I had left was ever going to, like you said, I didn't think that would happen, that we would split and have fractures within our own family, which then it was that whole year that she first did that. I felt like I was grieving her. Now, obviously not on the same level, but my brain went there. My brain thought, what if I never speak to her again? What if she never wants to talk to me again? And so for me, it became an always, just like Alex, like And I suddenly was sitting in this house, and I thought we had a good family. I thought we had good, everybody. So and I've had mom say this over and over again. I thought I had done everything right. We were a close family. We were living in a good area. The schools were good. All the things that we think somehow protect us from this type of tragedy. And they don't. It can happen to anybody at any time. And that's the message that is hard to hear for people. But that's why having the tools, having the conversations, being able to face it head on and not turn from it and just shove it off in the corner as a not possibility doesn't do us any good, because it could happen anyway, right? So we're better off to be armed to handle, hopefully, keeping the crisis from happening. But if not, knowing that, there's going to have to be a way to survive this afterwards. So
I love your answer so much. And so, Frank, I'm going to come to you, but talk about the power of modeling that behavior.
I mean, the word like permission comes to mind,
yes.
right? There's kind of a lead by example of, if you're open about your feelings, and it kind of gives permission to everybody else too. At the same time, like there is, so I'm going to kind of let you off the hook a little bit. Like there is that fine line of, being open about where you're at. But I think there are times where anybody who is close to a death situation seems to go so far into sadness that now it's almost like everybody else has to take care of that person, whoever they are, right? And so now we're just taking care of another person instead of everybody, being able to kind of go through their own process, right? So it's not just a one-sided thing of, were you open about how you were feeling or not? But there's that balance of, you almost can't just entirely let the floodgates open and portray this completely kind of broken persona, even if that's how you feel in that moment, because then that kind of takes the focus off in a different way. So it almost sounds like there's no winning, right? There's no perfect way to do this. I don't think anyone could ever look at any grief situation and be like, that person or that family handled that perfectly. Everyone should do it that way. I don't think that exists. And I think anything that we go through, we can always look back and identify things that maybe we could have done a little bit more of or a little bit less of. And that, I mean, that's hindsight. I honestly think that for the most part. That's why I got excited
about it. I hope you didn't feel picked on at all. I got excited about the opportunity to talk about modeling behavior.
Yeah.
And because there is no right way to do this, but when we feel things, I do think that it's important for our kids to see us feeling those things. It's important for our spouses to see us feeling those things. And it doesn't mean that it has to be on all the time. But again, I just love that we have this conversation about modeling behavior and how we're learning, right? Because that's why we have you here, is to learn from people who've lived it, to learn from somebody who's gone through this.
I'm a big fan of narrating what's kind of going on in my head out loud. This idea of and I call it narrating because it's literally like it's describing to an audience that would not otherwise know unless I kind of verbally told them. But this idea of, I am really sad. There are times where I feel broken, et cetera, all of that openness. At the same time, you might not see that from me all of the time, right? There are some times where I have to put that away because I have to get X, Y, or Z done, or because I have to take care of someone else. So you may not see that all the time, but understand that that's happening within me, right? So it's almost like that meta openness, right? That openness about openness, but that sounds really convoluted, right? So I summarize it with narration. This is everything that's going on in my head. These are the things that you might see sometimes, you might not see other times, but understand that all of these things are kind of happening all the time. That's my personal best strategy to, and I'll use it's no different than like if you have a significant other and just like, if there's a couple hours during the day where I'm busy and I can't text you, like just always know that I'm thinking about you, right? That narration of even if an action is or is not there, understand what's going on in my head 100% of the time.
Well,
Melissa, anything to add to that?
I do. So going back to the idea of modeling, I feel like some of it is about trying to figure out how to strike a balance, right? Because could I have done it perfectly? No, because I don't think that exists. Not in a world where you're talking about everything being so decimated by what happened. How does somebody know how to perfectly handle being destroyed, right? But, and especially when there's multiple people that this has altered the course of their life type of destroyed, right? So there's no way to do it perfectly. But for me, I had mental health loss and grief modeled so poorly by my own mother, who was very ill mentally. Well, she's not dead. She's still with us, but she has been ill her whole life. My father died when he died 25 years ago. He was only 48. I was 30. He got diagnosed with cancer, was gone very quickly in 4 months. And that was what I thought at the time going to be this devastating life event. But my mother had so many issues and struggles that, true to form, when my dad passed, she lost her shit. It was the Sharon shit show again, and everything centered around my mother's inability to cope. And so much so, and I was the oldest child, so much so, my dad had taught me to be a perfect codependent, so I stepped right into his shoes. And a year after my dad had passed, my best friend at the time looked at me and said, "One of these days, you're going to have to quit grieving the loss of your mother's husband and start grieving the loss of your own father." And I say that because her husband and my father were obviously the same person, but she was very profoundly pointing out that all of my energy was geared towards my mom saying her loss was the worst and her loss was the one that mattered. And the rest of us were just. And so I had grief and loss modeled so poorly that what skill set did I even have to start with anyway? So for me, I have spent the better part of my adult life with the model of, what would Sharon do? Do the exact opposite. Like, to be fair, people say, "Oh, you were a great mother." And I'm thinking, because I mothered in spite of how I was mothered. But regardless, for that moment of levity that brings to all of us, it was a very serious thing for me to learn how to have to grieve properly, meaning in a way that was authentic, because in the beginning I just was doing that. Don't do what Sharon did. Don't stay in bed. Don't lose it. Don't make the whole world be about you, because other people lost Alex too, and all of it. So I probably went too far one direction and needed to try to strike more of a balance, because did I want my kids to see mom as a shit show every day? No. But did they need to see that once in a while? Sure, they did. They needed to see more of it than I allowed them to.
Again,
Matthew,
this is why I'm so excited that we're talking about this, because you don't know until you know. And we only know the way we're brought up. And it's so, like in your case, Melissa, you see one thing, you're going to do that or the opposite. Sorry, Frank, you were getting ready to say something.
No, I was going to, like, how many times have we talked about this idea? Like, you either end up kind of modeling after what you grew up with from your parent, or you kind of denounce it and try to do the exact opposite if you recognize that, like, that wasn't good, so I'm going to try to do this other thing. And sometimes, not always, but like a lot of times the answer is to Goldilocks it as best as possible, right? Like, let's not go too far in either direction, but let's try to find the one that's just right as best as possible. And a lot of that, like, a couple of times, eventually we'll figure that out.
For sure. But and I was going to say, and actually what we should be doing in these cases is utilizing the people on this screen, utilizing what you now, Melissa, are trying to do and help other parents go through. Frank is a psychologist. Like, in these times of real turmoil, this is when we need to reach out to professionals and people who have been through it before, so that we can gain some understanding, so that we can get that knowledge that you talked about. And so as we start to kind of wind down our podcast, I would love to ask you and find out, as we enter the 7th season, as you put it so beautifully to me before we started recording, of losing Alex. How do you think about him now? When Alex crosses your mind, what are those thoughts that you have? Do you see him as a little boy? Do you think about him as like where he would have been as a 30-year-old? Or, like, how do you envision your son now?
Oh, that's such a great question. Thanks for asking it. It's nearly 7 years. I'm at such a different place than I would have been if we had done this at year 2 or 3. But I spend so much time thinking about Alex's life at this point. And in the beginning years, I spent so much time in that 1 second of his death. And so that's the difference is that I do know some moms say, I always see my kid at this certain age. I see all of it. Alex was just, and I know it seems so convenient once somebody's gone to say they were wonderful. But I was never a fan of that before. And I'm like, well, I can't help it. He was wonderful. And I just see all of it. I do. I spend a lot of time, I think, thinking about the age he was when he died. And then in my mind, I'm taking him further. And recently, Parker, my youngest, his brother, they were extremely close, was on my podcast. He's been on it a couple of times. So he was on for a sibling roundtable where I got a bunch of siblings together. And to hear him talk about it was really enlightening to me as well. So, it's just there's a lot there. So, yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, I'm getting so emotional just listening to you talk about it because I'm a dad. I can't imagine one of my kids going, right? Frank's literally just gotten married and found out he's pregnant. Like, this is in your future, Frank, is you're going to fall in love with these little freaking kids, like so
on a level that you just can't even understand.
It's just unbelievable how the way you're going to fall in love with them and the connection that you're going to feel towards that person. Do you still feel Alex around you?
Well, yes, 100%. Now, everybody has different beliefs about that. I am not, as they would call it, a God-fearing woman. I'm not a Christian woman. However, I'm a very spiritual person, and I 100% know Alex is still with us. I know that his soul didn't die. The energy that was Alex is still there. And actually, it's strange. I sometimes tell people now that while I would still rather have him here physically, in many ways, I kind of feel closer to him today because he feels like he's with me so much. Like, I communicate with him a lot. I'm able to, feel connected. He does leave signs a lot. And my other children also, who are grown, 25 and 28, while I talk to them, they're grown-ups. My 25-year-old son doesn't need to talk to his mommy every day. Luckily, he does want to talk to his mom a decent amount. He still likes to take a vacation with us every year, all the things, but he doesn't want to talk to me every day. And so there's still that disconnect a little bit where with Alex, he's accessible to me all the time. Again, not in the same way, but he is more accessible to me on that level. So
it's incredibly beautiful. Let's end where we started. I know I will always be a work in progress, but now I know I can live a good life right alongside my grief. And so for anybody else, where this is your truth now, where this is the life that you have to keep moving forward with, any advice on how to carry grief and pain at the same time?
Yeah, get out there and find a place to connect, because this is one of the loneliest experiences you can go through. You feel like you're literally alone in an ocean and can see nothing as far as the horizon goes. And so to find a community to connect in is super important. To find resources is super important. I say at the time of loss, but also beyond, because you've got to fill your toolkit. You've got to start filling that toolkit. You've got to find a way to connect to other loss survivors that get it, because as badly as we don't want anybody else to be in this club, we also need somebody else to be in this club, meaning we need somebody that can look us in the eye and understands. And there's something that occurs there that transcends anything we can really understand. So finding a way to do that, whether it's, in-person support groups, obviously therapy in the beginning, but, and then also to start thinking about ways to offer a legacy for your child, because that's one of the top 3 things that every parent seems to feel is, I want my child to be remembered. The biggest fear is that they're going to be forgotten and their life was for nothing. So finding ways to do those things are super important for not only the short term, but the long term prognosis of learning how to live alongside of this.
Frank, any final thoughts from you?
No, that was perfect. I'm not touching that.
I feel the same way. I'm not touching that either. We will link to Melissa's podcast so that you guys can check it out. Thank you, Melissa, for just putting it all out there today. And I always say this when we interview somebody who's, lost a child to suicide, like, I feel like we got to know Alex today, which is neat for us to kind of understand this kid a little bit and know what he was all about. I know he wasn't such a kid anymore, but 21 is way too young. Any closing remarks from you, Melissa?
No, I feel like you did a great job. I'm not used to not being the one to make the closing remarks. You know what it's like. Sometimes it's hard to sit in the other chair. So I hope I did good.
You were just fantastic. And like I said, we will connect to everything that Melissa's got going on. Should you feel compelled to reach out to her and connect with what she's got going on. Dr. Frank, thank you so much for your time today too.
Always a pleasure.
See you guys next time.
We have 3 goals with Learn from People Who Lived It. 1, to help you feel less alone. 2, encourage you to seek out a coach, a therapist, a church, anyone who can help you get through your journey and find some healing. 3, when you're ready, share your story with us.
Find Learn from People Who Lived It wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from People Who Lived It.